Aloha, friends, and welcome to part 6 of Being in the Way. This one's called I Am. Something that I kind of love, honestly, about this city where we live, Jacksonville, Florida, particularly like the downtown area, is how we're perpetually, almost there. Did you hear about the new developments downtown? Said every hopeful 20 something hipster for the last 25 years. And to me, I don't know, it's just kind of part of our rustic charm. The fact that we're just still waiting on that breakthrough. And I bring this up because this phenomenon, this almostness, translates directly to what I would consider to be like mainstream religion's definition of what the spiritual life is. Almost there, always improving, always growing, always measuring, always working towards something just ahead, trying to grow, trying to heal, trying to become more loving, trying to become more peaceful or more whole. Carl Jung wrote that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. And that's a very different thing than the task of a lifetime is to construct a better version of myself and then try to have it validated by as many people as possible, which is basically what our ego tends to do with words like that. And I'm just going to say that the thesis, the organizing principle of this teaching is that Jesus essentially says, don't go that way. That's not the only game in town. Rather, he says, enter through the narrow gate. For wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But small is the gate and narrow is the road that leads to life, and there are only a few who find it. And in Matthew's telling, his next words are, beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravenous wolves. You'll recognize them by their fruit. A good tree can't produce bad fruit, and a rotten tree can't produce good fruit. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven. Only those who abide in the desires of God. Many will say to me, Lord, Lord, didn't we prophesy in your name and drive out demons in your name and perform miracles in your name? And I will say plainly, yes, but I never knew you. So depart from me, for you have misunderstood the purposes of God. Now, this verse used to flat freak me out in my youth and young manhood, because I would read it and I would think, I never knew you. I don't even really understand what that means exactly, but I do know that I'm not particularly efficient at prophecy or exorcisms or the performance of miracles. And so if I have not yet attained to that level of spirituality, then how in God's name could I hope to be safe? Because I don't even understand what this next level, it's not a it took me years of struggle and sorrow and striving to realize that Jesus isn't talking about doing more and getting better, is he? Maybe those of you with healthier attachment systems figured that out sooner than me. And he's kind of suggesting the opposite, isn't he? He's more or less saying that doing more and getting better is one of the most effective ways to maintain a safe distance from the God that we say we're searching for. The self-improvement model is a lot more satisfying to the human ego than the path, the way that Jesus describes, which is one of just surrender. It's this pathless path. I remember at a church conference somewhere along the way, somebody said to me, the best place to hide from God is in the church, because the church will keep you busy. All right, so what is going on in this passage? Why are a couple of shoe-ins for the Disciple of the Month Club being turned away at the gates of heaven? It's not like their lives are absent of fruit, they're pointing to all their accomplishments, and they're all the stuff that Jesus was doing. Just seems like what Jesus is drawing our attention to is that their fruit was produced from the tree of striving rather than the tree of union, oneness, gnosis, knowing. You know, we grow up hearing in one way or another from such a young age that, you know, this world's a dangerous place and that life is hard and that nobody's going to live it for you and that it's kind of up to you to become somebody. And so just baked into the experience of being human is this feeling of incompleteness and this pressure to become. But just think for a minute about the metaphor that Jesus used here, that of a tree growing, you know? Jesus didn't say that you will know a tree by how hard it works to produce some good fruit for daddy. It's not how trees work. Trees aren't on their way to becoming somebody or something someday, at least not in a way that causes like comparison and a fear that they're not keeping up. Trees are just participating in their own unfolding. They grow at their own speed. They fruit when it's time. They go dormant in the winter, some of them losing all of their leaves, looking essentially dead. It's a process. Life is a process. And I honestly think that one of the biggest burdens of being human is just that we're strapped with this level of consciousness, that we're actually maybe the only thing in all of creation capable of becoming confused about the truth of who we are. You know, like geraniums don't struggle being geraniums because geraniums don't wish that they were daisies or something. Because we've been conditioned to believe and behave like we're somehow apart or separate from the whole of creation, the shared life that imbues every living thing, you and me included. And we've been trained to behave like we have to fight our way back in. Like our lives need to be in constant bloom. Like we can't also have seasons of fallow. But you know what happens when you try to keep a plant in constant bloom, you know, when you just like blast a fruit tree with nitrogen regardless of the season that it's in, even if it's telling you, hey man, I need a break, look, I'm losing my leaves, would you just let me take a nap? You know what happens if you just keep blasting a fruit tree with nitrogen fertilizer is that you get fruit for a few seasons and then you get toxic fruit and then you burn out the plant and then the plant dies. And the same is true of us. To change metaphors for a minute, this is Alan Watts. We thought of life as a journey, a pilgrimage, which had a serious purpose at the end. But we missed the point the whole way along, that life is a musical thing to be sung along to and danced. When we make music, we don't do it in order to reach the end of the composition or to get to some certain point in the song. If the purpose of music was to see who could get to the end of the song fastest, then the best players would be the fastest players. All music would be punk rock. But that isn't its purpose. The whole point of the dancing is the dance. There's a line in an Emily Dickinson poem where she says, "There is no arrival when every step is an arrival." Do you know what Jesus' favorite insult was? Pop quiz. It was hypocrite. A quick Google search told me that at least 15 times Jesus called the Pharisees, the religious leaders of the day, hypocrites. Hypocrite is an interesting word. It doesn't sound like English, does it? And that's because it isn't English. It's actually a Greek word that made it into the English lexicon virtually unscathed. And when you hear the word hypocrite, what do you think of? I think the common definition of what a hypocrite is somebody who kind of acts against their values, somebody who says they stand for one thing and then secretly, covertly does something totally different. That's what it's come to mean. But its literal translation, hypocrite, it's a theater word, and it has to do with these ancient Roman theaters where the stage players would wear these hardened masks that could only have one expression presented, and that was so that everybody, even the people way up in the cheap seats, could easily identify who was who on stage and keep track of the events in the play. And so hypocrite, it direct translates to interpret or to speak from underneath, from behind a mask. So in the truest sense of the word, a hypocrite isn't simply somebody who acts against their own values. Hypocrisy actually refers to the condition of being so lost in our role that we've forgotten completely about the truth of who we are. Our responses are just reactions. Our ability to notice nuance and to balance complexity is all but zero. We are so fused to a role that it's nearly impossible for anything novel or new to actually happen in our lives. One time, Jesus got all the religious leaders so riled up because of his hypothesis as to why they were having a difficulty understanding his teaching. And in the defense of the religious leaders, they got kind of riled up because he told them that their parentage was different from his. He said, if we shared the same father, you'd understand me, but you don't get it because your father is Satan. So there may be a reason why they responded rather strongly to that. But here's a little paraphrase of the conversation. So Jesus offers that hypothesis. They replied with a rather comically straightforward question. They said, are we right when we say that you are a Samaritan? He wasn't. He was Jewish. And also possessed by demons? I mean, who says yes to that? Jesus replied, no, and that's not a helpful question. If you would just listen to my teaching and actually look where I'm pointing, you'll find real life. You will, in fact, never taste death. The Pharisees responded to this obvious good news by saying, aha, we knew that you were possessed. You say that if we follow your teaching, we'll never taste death. But Abraham died, all of the prophets died. Are you saying you're greater than all of them? Which obviously is exactly what he's talking about. Jesus said, you are, again, missing the point. I say these things not to bring attention or glory to myself, but to point to God who's already glorified me. If you knew the same God, you would understand what I mean. Abraham rejoiced at the thought of my coming. The Jews replied, you aren't even 50 years old, and you've seen our father Abraham? And Jesus said, very truly I tell you, before Abraham was, I am. At this, they picked up stones to kill him, but Jesus hid himself and slipped away through the crowd. Religious leaders here are incensed because they infer that Jesus is referring to himself as God, which he kind of basically is. But you got to remember that he wants the same perspective for them. He says, if you would just drop your masks for a minute and put down your stones and your accusations and actually look to where I'm pointing, then you will never taste death. It's something like, Jesus is saying something like, I am, and so are you. Now, I used to, when I was a kid, read these stories and I would see the Pharisees as the bad guys. And then I got a little bit older and I came to realize that, well, the Pharisees, the religious leaders, would have been friends of Jesus. Like, he grew up in temple and they would have been his mentors and the elders of his community, and so it must have been deeply confusing to him to have this much conflict with them. And then as I continued to read the stories, I started to realize, like, oh gosh, the Pharisees aren't just historical figures. They're like, I know them. I know them from the inside. I know them because I've met them in here. Like, you know that little voice? It's like you've come to encounter God in some profound way, in some liberating way, in a way that actually kind of contradicts some of the things that you've been taught, some of the beliefs that you hold on to. It just blows the whole paradigm out of the water. It tastes like freedom. And a little bit of time passes, sometimes right in the middle of it, and here comes this voice that's like, yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure if we can trust this because, it doesn't fit with the model, the pre-existing model. And sometimes I wonder if that was the point of Jesus' miracles entirely. Because whoever he healed, even the guy he raised from the dead, Lazarus, eventually they died. It's the ultimate statistic. 1 and 1 die. So I've wondered if the whole point of a miracle is to serve the liberation of those who experience and witness it. Because basically a miracle asks, can your current model of reality accommodate what you just saw? And if not, are you willing to update your model of reality, even if it means walking mapless through the forest for however long it takes? See, Jesus was an expert channel switcher. He could speak from the perspective of a kind of marginalized refugee, blue-collar worker when he said things like, why do you call me good? I'm not good. It's only my Father in heaven who's good. He speaks of like a separation between him and God, a distinction, a difference. He could also channel switch into the divine nature of his being and say something like he did here to the Pharisees, something essentially like, do you believe me to be only my name, my family, these thoughts, this past, this body? And from the channel of ego and separateness, fused to their roles, the religious leaders say to him, yeah, dude, of course that's what we assume you to be. What are you talking about? All right, here's a metaphor I first heard on a podcast by Michael Gungor that I have slightly repurposed, and I think it's helpful. You ready? The theater production company in town has been feverishly promoting their upcoming performance of Romeo and Juliet. Opening night, packed house. Everything is going splendidly. Act 2, Scene 2 begins, and Juliet's there on the balcony as a lovelorn Romeo says to her, "What soft, what light through yonder window breaks? It is the east, and Juliet is the sun." And Juliet looks down at Romeo and responds, "Who's Juliet? The name's Bill Shakespeare." As reviews for the play started being published in the following days, the art critics all agreed. It was a moving rendition up until Act 2, Scene 2, when the actress playing Juliet experienced some kind of a schizoid event and mistook herself for the author. Yeah, I mean, that's essentially what Jesus did to the religious leaders here with his response. And we can see why it's confusing and upsetting. We're all sort of relying on each other to just not break character so we can keep this whole thing moving along smoothly. Was Jesus wrong in what he said? Would you be deluded in saying the same about yourself? Are we not all figments of God's imagination? Meister Eckhart wrote that people ought not think so much about what they are to do, but rather about what they are. And really, that's the whole teaching. Here's St. Paul. He said, hey, newsflash, we don't always see things clearly. In fact, we're squinting through fog at a reflection in a dark mirror. But this is the thing about the weather, is that it always changes. The fog clears, the sun returns, and it illuminates our sight. And in God's light, we see that we're complete. We, in fact, see it all as clearly as God sees us, knowing God directly, just as God knows us. We can't see clearly. And until it's time for us to see certain things, we experience life fused to our roles. And there's nothing wrong with just like maybe a helpful thought experiment. If you take a minute and just think, what role am I most attached to? What role seems absolutely necessary for my sense of self to have continuity? Being a mother, being a father, being a son, being a daughter, being whatever it is you do for work, being a nice person, being the funny person, being the person who helps folks feel comfortable, being the rebel, being the punk rocker, voting Republican, voting Democrat, whatever it is. Just picture it in context of eternity. Let's say that you are living in heaven today, and it's heaven just like how it was explained to me as a kid, where I get to go on bobbying forever in eternity, just with no pain and gold streets. Now, when you're in heaven, are you going to vote Democrat or Republican? When you're in heaven, are you going to worry about your reputation? Are you going to be concerned about the future? But the thing is what Jesus declared, lived, revealed, is that now is eternity. That, like Dickinson says, eternity is composed entirely of nows. That the kingdom of heaven is at hand. That the kingdom of heaven is around us and within us. And we are invited to live outside of the roles. Not in a way that removes us completely from our responsibility to them, but certainly in a way that lessens the intensity and the pressure to perform. You know, some things become a cliche because they're so true. And one of them that I think is very useful is that old saying that if you love something, let it go. And if it was real, it's unavoidable. And if it doesn't come back to you, then it was never real to begin with. I think we can say this about the roles that we inhabit. There are some things that we really just are going to do because it's written in our destiny to do them. It is a true expression of the core of our being. And then there's just a whole mess of stuff piled on top of that we're doing because it makes us feel important. It helps us feel safe. Somebody else told us to do it, so we feel like our spot in the herd or the group is dependent on our performance in certain ways. And there's nothing wrong with these roles, but we can learn to hold them, to occupy them with a lot more integrity and freedom and looseness and maybe even joy. When we recognize that we have nothing to prove and that we're already home and that God knew us before we were born. At birth, we are imbued with the Ruach, the life, breath, the Spirit of God. That God's closer to us than we are to ourselves, and that the entire message of the New Testament is grace. And grace says you don't have to do anything. 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 That's the message of grace. I mean, the birds get it. That bee gets it. So why don't we get with it this week? Right now. All right. I think that's a wrap. Thanks for being here. Thanks for being you. We'll see you around. Peace.